All right, thank you very much, Atmaz. Kicking things off today with a Russian mirror match in the launch of Resurgence. We have all the cards now for this expansion. Blue and green have been added. We'll see what players are cooking up. Scorch, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. I'm very, very excited to see what the players are going to bring out. Of course, not a huge chunk of time to test all of the new cards, but there are definitely some that I definitely think we're going to see be very, very prevalent throughout the course of the day.
Yeah, I have a feeling mono green is going to be highly represented in this tournament. To get a buff with the Blossoming Kodama. I've seen a few variations of mono green, Beastmasters utilizing it, the big green, where you just play a lot of the bigger green creatures like Oakfather and Primeval Colossus, go for the Tree of Everlife and the Sky Whale. So this Blossoming Kodama has actually opened up a lot of options for green now, and green having access to Sky Whale is just such a big buff for the deck.
Yeah, that Kodama, like you mentioned, is absolutely massive because it's almost like mid-game ramp. Of course, have wood elementals early on if you can get those. Then you get to the 5 forest point, which is very big for things like Therian Golem that was already played in mono green. And now you have that extra ramp to get to, like you're saying, the removal option of running Skywhale or the late game engine that is Tree of Everlife.
I always felt that Tree of Everlife should have been a mono green card, and I think the Kodama has definitely complemented that card. It's an option for mono green to go later into the game now, not just relying on outvaluing their opponent with Beastmasters like they did before. They now have proper late game option in this Tree of Everlife. And also, like I said, the removal, Moby being available for mono green, it's very good. Swallow at least the swallow abilities of Moby, like the Crystal Flower, has been restricted to these multicolored decks now. Rako and Zinyax especially utilizing that card. So the swallow mechanic being given to green, gives them more removal options, and which they don't have currently.
Yeah, exactly. And as you kind of briefly touched on there with the Beastmaster deck that also exists in mono green, I think the new Emissary is a fantastic addition to that style because if you can get the buffs onto a Beastmaster, that actually means that it will be buffed by your other Beastmasters because it gets to that 5 life point. So another mono green deck that we could see that can really snowball an advantage early on in the game.
But one thing I have learned from my journeys of mono green over the last few days is that blue jump tends to destroy it because they've been given more tools. Tritons have their own subtype now, which has a lot of synergy. A Tide Lord is a nice finisher now for blue and blue-green jump. It just gives them an alternative way to put down a big body that isn't a Colossus. But also the new Banquet card. That card is insane.
Yeah, it's really incredible the value that it can create. Of course, when you put it down and get it to trigger right away, it's a campfire, but then you also have a creature left behind as the last word. So the fact that blue jump generally dictates the trades in the early game, you can then set that up to either further buffs down the road or have your creatures in a position where your opponent's taking the trade and then you have that collector left over behind. It's an archetype that's been around for such a long time now as well. A lot of players will be very familiar with it. So getting additional tools into it just means it's even better than it was before.
And also mentioning Moby in mono green, you can actually use the Banquet to counter Moby plays, because if a creature has swallowed the Banquet, Moby cannot swallow that creature because the swallow effect has already been taken. So that's another way to protect your creatures from Moby if you are playing as blue. But yeah, I feel that there's a lot of different options now for blue and green. There's the old blue-green jump that was coming back before, but now it definitely has more tools. The Beast variant was very strong previously, but there are different options going into that. But what's going to interest me going forward in this tournament is how red and yellow are going to be represented.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. Throughout this week, I've actually seen a few different styles of red-yellow as a combination. Historically, we've seen it mostly just as burn, but there's been kind of a events like red-yellow control that I've seen come back about. There's been, of course, still that burn, but the interesting thing to me is if we see them split and you see mono yellow or mono red, or if we see these as more complementary tools throughout the course of the day.
I think one thing some of the top players may consider is reviving Yellow Tempo in order to counter these greedy green decks. And we look at the lineup here, the game is about to start. MrTea, from what I can see, is some form of blue jump, maybe Dream Reaver. We have Green Yellow Sacrifice, which is also very strong recently, thanks to Teddy winning a recent Open. Some yellow deck getting banned here, so doesn't want the green to run into that potential yellow tempo. And looks like a blue-red bargain, or maybe a blue-red gem shell deck.
Yeah, it definitely looks like it would be something in line with Gem Shell, because you can see there's 33 cards there, and it is a very high cost in the 5.4. It could just be something more along the lines of like Garrett and Creation, but there's way too many red there. So generally would expect that to be something along the lines of a Gem Shell bargain style deck.
No, I was just thinking then, is MrTea going to ban the Rakoan deck on the right just because he doesn't know what it's going to be like? What is that deck? Look at its land count. And it has Yulani in it.
I love the way that the decks display the colors here, because there are 48 land, there are 48 like cards technically shown in that land count for the Yulani deck, which is way above the 30, but it just shows how many cards in there share land requirements among different colors. And that's just kind of the way that the Rakoans are. You have a lot of 1-1 or 2-2, and then of course Ulani covers all 4. So very interested to see what that deck is from LightSapfier.
You know, I had a feeling that Light would bring something spicy to his lineup. He is quite a creative deck builder, so I'm hoping we get to see whatever that last deck is, because it looks Rakoan right now, but it could be anything, right? It could be a Yak deck, it could be a Rakoan deck, it could be the Return of Free Wishes, who knows?
Yeah, it's very true. Like, we see the deck cover there being Ulani, but that may just be a draw engine, realistically. It could just be that you want it to draw one of every card, and you're running something completely different than Rakoans.
And the lineup we have right now, or the matchup we have right now, is this red-blue deck from MrTea versus light mono-blue. And that's as mono as it gets, because it is just all lakes. 30 lakes are being utilized in the deck, no neutrals. So this must be some... Oh, I'm a little bit of a technical issue. Yeah, I think there was a timeout there for LightSapfier.
Yeah, and like you said, with it being 30 blue, it is kind of telling into what it would be. Most of the time, if you're looking at something like a Dream Reaver list, you're running some neutrals in there for Radiance, for Emperor's Command. A lot of the times, even like a blue control would have something similar with the Emperor's Command. But blue jump, I think, is just Tritons and control tools, essentially.
Yeah, no neutrals at all. So perhaps it's not... See, if it was Dream Reaver, I'd expect to see Radiance now, one or the other. Like, the new Radiance is a very good finisher for decks that can play it, especially the greedy control decks. Even Rush decks can run the new Radiance if they get to that 10th area. It can definitely lock out like positional play, but we didn't see any neutrals at all. So I think you're right there. I feel that it's probably some form of blue jump, maybe one that utilizes libraries. Because you can build like hyper tempo blue jump, where it's just like lots of little weenies. You rush down the one side quickly and you just apply pressure from your opponent as well. Play the Colossus, or you could play like a bit of a slow burner, go for those lakes of the water elementals and get libraries down and just like snowball your economy advantage. So there's a lot of different ways you can actually build blue jump. And LightSapfier, I think that's going to be jump, like you said. I can't see it being Dream Reaver without any neutrals. Another thing to consider as well, if you're not running neutrals, you're not running healing. So if you're not running healing, you're probably not running library, unless you're really...
Yeah, and the kind of dual use there to, well, really triple use to Emperor's Command, all those different ways that you can utilize it for the healing, like you mentioned, in the late game, if you have to, using it to kill off your own library, or the control that it gives with the -2/-1. It just is such a strong card to have in that archetype.
Yeah, we've seen campfires being ran in blue jump in the past. Campfire and Emperor's Command. It's been important for Blue Jump to get that little bit of a power push when it doesn't have Frogify available, if it doesn't have Humbling Visions. And that's where the new Banquet is such a powerful card, because it's like a reusable Campfire in some situations. And it's just an absolute nightmare to deal with, because even if you clear the creature who has swallowed the Banquet, if you don't have the answer to the Banquet can utilize itself again on the following turn. So it's a card you really have to respect.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that it's one lake, it also fits into a lot of different things. Like you said, it of course gets into the blue jump like we've been talking about, but you could also have it in the green blue like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, you pretty much splash it in any deck that has blue. We did see Superb Lizard running a blue-yellow tempo in the halftime tournament. We didn't actually get to see it play, but he was running the Explorers. He's running stuff like Toe Ship. That's a massive buff for that deck. And you could even now play like Yellow Tempo with a splash of the Oversky Toe Ship and the Banquet, and just have them as your blue cards. So there's lots of ways you can stick that card into a deck, and I can see it being just a good splash card. It's just like Outland Ranger has been such a powerful card for so long. This seems like a unique version of Outland Ranger, maybe even a stronger version than it.
Yeah, I mean, it's more fairy efficient than Outland Ranger with the Campfire, and you potentially get more uses of it. Now, it does die in kind of the same ways because it has the 2 life, the same as the Outland Ranger. So something like Soul Drain, Cypher's Wrath, if your opponent is actually able to dictate a trade and then clear it off, they can generally do that pretty easily, but it's kind of still Faria neutral, right? They're spending most of the time 2 Faria in those removal to clear off your 2 Faria creature, and you've already generally got value out of it.
I think we're getting into the match now, so everything's looking good. It is going to be a blue jump, and we do see Looking Glass Phantom now. The community is split on how good this card is. Some are saying it's a better version of Frogify now. Others are saying it's not very good at all. What do you think of it?
I think it's actually really interesting. I don't know how strong it is yet, just because I haven't seen it in a strong enough deck yet. But realistically, in the early game, if you can get something like a Water Elemental down, depending on what your opponent plays, if it's something big and you can Looking Glass Phantasm, you can trade the Water Elemental into that card. Sets up the same with something like Bloated Toad is also a 3/3 in the early game, and then you just have to have something left behind to kill off the frog that is generated by that. But blue actually has some good early game creatures that have 3 attack that trade pretty efficiently into whatever you transform into the 5/3.
Speaking of water elementals, LightSapfier definitely pushing down the left-hand side here. It has another water elemental available, so can set up that Tylord nice and quickly. And now that we have seen the Looking Glass Phantom, we do know that this deck does want to go to 5 lakes to have access to that. My question is there library? Library with no neutrals? It doesn't seem likely. And speak of the devil, it's popped back up.
Yeah, just like you mentioned, and also like you mentioned, the Water Elemental is in LightSapfier's hands, mean he could hit 4 lakes this turn. Really strong position to get into. I'm actually surprised by the Water Elementals in a what looks more Triton-heavy blue jump, because they don't have that Triton tag. Is the land ramp, of course, which he needs for the Phantasm, but generally the Triton jump that I've seen throughout the course of this week has been Triton Warriors, Battletoads, and then all of these Triton cards synergy in the mid game, rather than some of the ramp and then control tools.
Like Light is going for like a really high tempo line here, just kind of dumping all his creatures on the board. He could have went for a safer line of putting his water elemental in between the lakes and then being out of reach of the Archon. But it looks like LightSapfier is really valuing stopping MrTea collecting on off this left hand.
I was actually going to say on last turn as well, surprised that MrTea actually went for double Archons. I think in that turn, even though he had started with a lake on turn 1, he could have gone Mountain and then Garridened on this turn, although that does set you up for potentially your opponent removing that with something like a Frogify. Of course, we see the Phantasm in hand, so that's an option. But in that turn, I think MrTea could have kind of made the decision to go for Garriden, which would have come down now, potentially far side of the board, and just gone for collection. blue-red, especially in this type of heavy cost bargain style deck, you really need the collection. Otherwise, you fall behind very quickly.
Yeah, I quite like that actually. Going for the right side Garadan, having that double collector fly back and forth, just representing all those resources, and forcing LightSapfier to have that answer, like you said. But it's just an easy clear here for the new Triton. He's going to take the Archon, and then we set the 6/6. So a 6/6 on the well here is so good. Like 6 attack, 6 life is like a dream, I think, for like a mid-range creature.
And a big thing to point out as well, there, like you were mentioning, how aggressive LightSapfier went with putting down creatures, actually blocked the Archon from MrTea from collecting onto the bottom left corner here. And he's actually 2 Faria away from Garridan on this turn, which could have potentially been reached by having that Archon collect.
Oh, wow, that's a good Telltale Turtle. Oh, geez. And 0 cost Banquet as well. So can Banquet into the Tide Lord and put it up to a 7/7, just making it more difficult for the Archon to interact with it. But it looks like he's going to go for the Water Elemental. So if the Archon can interact with the Water Elemental without dropping the 7 costs required to power it up, it's going to trade. So this is really powerful position for LightSapfier.
Aquablad, we live in a world where Tale of the Old Turtle is seeing play. Can you believe it? Resurgence Part 2, bringing back some of these old cards that really haven't seen play in a long, long time, but does make sense. This type of blue jump is very creature heavy. We don't have the events in there like the Frogifies because LightSapfier is running the Phantasm. It's very, very heads up deck building coming out here.
And the Garadan, it gets played around now with the Banquet, so just being very aware of 12 Area 2 Mountains, so this Water Elemental will survive unless there's some extra removal in hand. But I think LightSapfier has an idea of what this deck wants to do. It's probably some greedy bargain deck, and this is kind of a sad Garadan, really. It does represent that double collect on the right, but it doesn't kill anything at all.
Yeah, and actually very heads up by LightSapfier as well with the Banquet. Like you were mentioning, could have got the Banquet onto the 7/7 or the 6/6 Tide Lord, made it a 7/7, but he was planning around the fact that Garridan was probably coming out from MrTea, so got the Banquet buff onto Water Elemental, and it's now protected as a 4/1. Like you mentioned as well, going to have that 2/2 spawn from it when it gets cleared.
I definitely feel like you use the Tide Lord here to kill Garridan, unless LightSapfier feels like he's in a position where he can just represent so much damage with these Ninja Toads that he could potentially set up lethal. Maybe like push 10 damage this turn, drop the Triton Warrior on that way. Yeah, so I think he's going to go for the lethal setup with the Triton Warrior and just force MrTea to have an answer. Now, MrTea is 1 land away from the Ice Rock Behemoth, and he will have an Etheria to play it. So maybe the Ice Rock Behemoth is going to be the savior.
It very much depends on what LightSapfier goes for here. Was hovering the Phantasm in hand there. Could have used that onto Garridan so that you deny your opponent from double collecting this turn. But saving it, because if that Ice Rock Behemoth does come down, it's very easy to just transform that and you still have the lethal setup.
Yeah, I like this from Light. Going for the aggressive play, trying to close out the game nice and early. You don't want to give blue-red too much time, because then they start to snowball, setting up these ice rocks, getting value off the gem shell if it's in the deck. This looks like a blue-red 7s to me, more than anything. We're seeing commanders now, we've got archons, there's even flame bursts in this deck, so there might not even be a gem shell in the build. We don't know yet, but we now know that Ice Rock Behemoth isn't enough. That Looking Glass Phantom will close out the game.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it very much could still be a deck that runs Gem Shell, but it's not the red-blue, like, true bargain that we've seen in the past, running things like Bold Bargainer and Ogre Dance. It very much is appearing like it's kind of the more control tools coming out from red, like the Flame Bursts.
And there we have it. Looking Glass Phantom, we were discussing this at the start of the match, saying, is this card good? And this is definitely a situation where the card is fantastic. And there we go, scoop in from MrTea, LightSapfier taking game number 1 with the Tale of the Old Turtle blue deck.
Yeah, a fantastic first game there. Also recognizing what your opponent is playing, just goes very aggressive into it. Blue Jump generally is very aggressive right off the early game as well, and then you either turn that into control back and forth with your opponent or just rush for the orb. And LightSapfier just didn't give MrTea time to set up at all, just went straight for the orb. I'm going to end this game as quick as possible.
It looks like a mirror is coming down the follow-up here. We do see some neutral cards in MrTea's variant. Mystic Beast as well, so this is probably gearing more towards getting those Colossus down, collecting off the opponent's well. Not a bad hand for MrTea. He does get that turn 2 Collector and Humbling Visions to help control the board. And LightSapfier also in a pretty decent spot with that Water Elemental and the Banquet as well.
Yeah, MrTea's the cards that we've seen so far generally, I think, lend itself to more of the old style of blue jump, what we used to see a lot, rather than kind of the new Triton synergy style that's come about with the Part 2 of Resurgence.
A little bit of trivia for everyone about LightSapfier. He is actually a kind of a regular user of Tale of the Old Turtle. LightSapfier piloted a angry blue-red-yellow deck using Tale of the Old Turtle. So it's not actually, it's no surprise now thinking about it that he's using this card, because it's something he's used in the past.
Yeah, very, very interesting to see it come out, in my opinion. But as you said, if it's a card that he's used, very comfortable playing and does fit very nicely into a deck. Of course, the turn that you play it, you sometimes do lose tempo unless you can get 0-cost creatures from it. But then you build back up so much tempo, and Blue Jump collects so efficiently that it's a great card just to get more creatures into your hand.
Yeah, it's one of those cards where you have to you have to pay for it. You pay that 6 Fairy, you don't get a return from it immediately, but if you are able to get that Fairy for later on, you do get a return later on with the reduced cost creatures. And we didn't see it have much of an impact really in a previous game. I guess we did, because he played the Triton Warrior, and then he was able to play the Phantasm. I don't know if he would have had Fairy otherwise.
I mean, even just the fact that it got the Banquet down right away was a massive swing, because it protected the Water Elemental.
Yes.
And that was a 0 cost because of the discount from Tale of the Old Turtle. So the fact that it was able to get something on that turn and then snowballed that into, like you mentioned, the Triton Warrior, and the discount onto the Phantasm didn't end up mattering because he still had the Faria to play it at full cost anyway, if necessary, on that last turn. But in that situation, it was actually more impactful, I think, to get the Banquet discounted.
This is a really good turn for MrTea. Double power reduction here, able to clear out all the creatures, but the Banquet will live, and it'll have an option to clear either the Commander or the Triton Warrior. Now that's going to be on 2 life, so it does get to collect a Fairy at least, and that does put all the Tale of Old Turtles into LightSapfier.
Wow.
But now, if these are the only events in his deck, he gets guaranteed value. Like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, like we were talking about, does lose a little bit of tempo on this turn, but look at how much he can play next turn.
Yeah, it's going to be crazy. He can actually just chain off Triton Trainers. I actually wouldn't mind +1 Triton Trainer now, because if you force a clear on the Warrior on the bottom, you're going to get the power up anyway on your next Triton, so it should work out quite nicely for LightSapfier.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting situation, I think, as well, because MrTea only has 1 card in hand. Your read there is, if I play a creature that MrTea has to trade into, or at least can't run away from, and then I can take the trade, then if MrTea doesn't have another creature, I gain momentum on the following turn because I have these other discounted creatures. So very heads up, I think, there by LightSapfier for that reason as well.
The only issue now is Humble Vision does work quite nice here. It does bring it down to 1 attack. So the Triton Warrior will get the favorable clear, but it's worth rolling the dice on it, right? You're banking on MrTea to have that 1 option in hand. Unfortunately, in this situation, MrTea does have it. May decide to keep it, because even if he does decide to Humble Vision here, it's actually pretty good, I think, for Light in the long term, because that's a Humble Vision he doesn't have to deal with later.
Yeah, I really like MrTea going for just the better setup here with the Archon. If you go for the Humbling Vision there, you have a 4/1 left behind that, potentially can trade into something else. But in this situation, you might as well just trade, and you have a 4/4 setup now in a possible double collection position on the other side. Interesting by LightSapfier there, goes for the buff first and then set up the Triton Trainer to get another buff onto the next creature rather than going for the double buff onto his Triton Warrior here.
Might want to save that buff for the Water Elemental, or potentially like a Tide Lord or something you can pick up later. But the double collection on the right here for MrTea is very strong. Just going to provide a lot of resource in the Battletoads to back it up as well. So a very good recovery from MrTea. And LightSapfier is definitely the aggressor here. I can see MrTea probably defend for a little bit before we see any real aggression from him.
Yeah, MrTea's deck actually kind of looks more control-y rather than a blue jump, more of a blue sevens potentially again, because we have the Phantasm, we have the Archon, and of course saw the Commander early on as well. Even though it started with a Triton Warrior, which generally you kind of think of more blue jump, it is kind of leaning more towards a 7 style list.
I like this line. Going for the aggressive lake now. Interesting position on the lake there, putting right in front, but the Banquet gonna be swallowed up by the trainer, and now this can challenge the Archon. So if Archon did want to push some damage this turn, that option is removed, and the trainer's there, ready to fight.
5/3 Warrior actually a little difficult for MrTea to deal with here. You can go for the Humbling Vision, but your Battletoad still dies. You can go for the Phantasm, but again, your Battletoad still just trades into that. So not able to really do what Blue wants to in this situation, which is dictate value trades. He's just kind of left in a position where you have to use something, potentially the Humbling Vision, just so he can play a commander, but...
I think MP is pretty good in some ways. I know it's a little sad you don't get the value here, but at least you put a 5/5 down for the 4/4 to run into. So you're kind of forcing Light to have maybe another Banquet, maybe an Aurora. We do see a Ninja Toad. Let's see what Tail brings out. Tail could definitely be very strong in this position. But, the Water Elemental also has the option of just jumping back and just waiting for the opportune moment to deal with this Phantasm.
Yeah, the Phantasm kind of sits in no man's land right now. If the Water Elemental jumps away, it's not in an immediate position to contest any creatures, and it's not collecting. So if LightSapfier can transition into clearing the Archon on the right side and then establish more creatures over there potentially, the game starts to flow in his favor just because MrTea can't collect to keep up.
Right now, we do see a trade with the Archon and the Triton Trainer. The Banquet will return. We're actually going to see a Tactician come behind as well, so another creature to collect. And LightSapfier has a better hand overall, I think. It's a lot more creatures, a lot more stability, and he represents Tri-Collected next turn. Right now, MrTea is only collecting off one well, unless he goes to the Ninja Toad line.
Yeah, and the Ninja Toad line looks like it lines up perfectly, right? It clears the Triton Trainer as the 4/3. The Archon could zip up and clear the 3/4. But we have the animated Banquet now, so the Archon's actually going to be blocked from that. It can clear the Banquet, but then you set up a good trade for LightSapfier back the other way, so it still ends up being awkward for MrTea to deal with.
It might actually just be worth killing the Banquet, because that Banquet just snowballs if you leave it alone. This could be the opportunity. The problem is, like you said, is the backswing. How many more resources can MrTea generate on the follow-up turn, especially without a creature that can sit in the double collection spot? If he does go for that line, he does let the Water Elemental kind of do what it wants, unless the Phantasm moves over. But if the Phantasm moves over, you open yourself up to the Water Elemental interacting with it with, say, an Aurora or a Banquet of its own. So just a very difficult situation for MrTea.
Yeah, so much so it looks like he's actually going to pull back even more defensive.
I like
Commander
this.
comes down, yeah.
It's just so awkward. But the problem is you give quad collection to Light now, and we see all those Ninja Toads in hand. This is looking very sad for MrTea right now.
The big thing right now is what does it transition into, I think. LightSapfier is controlling the board, but because of the way MrTea set up, he's not really able to get in hits to the orb and start to threaten ending the game at some point because of the deck that he's running until he draws something like the Looking Glass Phantasm. It's not really controlling the board with clears. So really, even though LightSapfier is controlling the board, it's still very much a stalemate because of the way that MrTea is playing so defensively.
Yeah, I can see that. That's the issue right now. Like you said, it's no damage is represented right now, and Mr. T's still in a decent defensive position. I think Light could probably go for a Ninja Toad, jump it down, then play the Tide Lord on the lake, and then get the power up, kill the 4-2, and then put the Water Elemental behind the Tide Lord. And that way he protects the Water Elemental and puts a 6-6 in the position. Oh, there was the power up from for the trainer. So he goes for the clear there instead. Okay, that's interesting.
It looks now like the Tide Lord, if it comes down, is going to come on the left side, which only gains... does still gain the 1-1 from the Triton, yes.
Oh, and the scoop. The only issue I had with that line, personally, was the Phantasm gets to take care of the 4-4. As you can see, Mr. T does scoop there, because there's just so much pressure that it's very difficult for Blue Jump to come back in that situation, because they need initiative. And I don't think Mr. T ever gets an initiative back in that game, not with Quad Collection happening.
Yeah, it's so difficult, and that again was, I think, a lot of value from the Tale of the Old Turtle. On the turn that it was played, he got so many discounts that you just flood the board on the following turns. You're playing against a deck that just can't keep up if it falls behind.
So this is going to be an interesting matchup. What I haven't seen yet, the new Blue Jump versus good old-fashioned Green-Yellow Sacrifice. We actually see a Bloom Sprite, Deepwood Stalker, what a pickup there, so can deal with some early frogs if he needs to. Demon Wrangler's pretty good with the Bloom Sprite as well. A 5-2 is actually a pretty solid creature to challenge some of the new cards. But Mr. T, playing these very defensive decks, and the Blue Jump is currently running away with the series.
Yeah, it definitely is. Is a very difficult matchup here as well for Mr. T, just because Green Yellow Sack, like you said, wants to be very slow, start to build up little bits of pressure of creatures just onto the board, and then eventually get to your Soul Eaters. But Blue Jump just gets at your creatures so fast that a lot of the time you can't get set up properly, and you never get to the Soul Eater point.
We're actually going to see a big swing, I think, in Mr. T's favor. Just to kick things off, the Deepwood Stalker on the 2-2, it kills that Banquet, and the 2-2 remains to be used later on. That's really strong to kick things off. I did play a bit of Green Yellow Sack myself, and I did find that Deepwood Stalker is a big player when it comes to this early game against Blue Jump.
And it's actually a pretty greedy line by LightSapfier there. Of course, does get the collection potentially set up next turn by going for the Banquet here, but could have just waited for next turn and looked at either another creature coming down and then playing the Banquet to get that buff, or going double Banquet so that you have it a little more protected from exactly this line of the Deepwood Stalker coming up from Mr. T.
Yeah, I like double Banquet, because if you double Banquet, one of them is going to swallow each other, right? I guess the first one played swallows, and then you get a free. I don't know if that interaction is correct. I've never tried it, but I would imagine the first played Banquet would trigger first, and then the second Banquet would eat that Banquet. I know it's a very roundabout way to say it, but yeah, it would have made a free in theory, but maybe Light hasn't seen that interaction, so he didn't go for it.
Getting all of these snowball tools before he gets kind of the proper creature down first, so doesn't get any of the buffs from Triton Tactician's own effect. Has to play the Banquet onto it, which of course does give you a 3/5, which is pretty strong in this situation, but just a lot of what could be for LightSapfier rather than the power that actually is.
And the 3/5 gets directly challenged by the Demon Wrangler. Gonna spawn a Demon Wing on the Bloom Sprite. Bloom Sprite finding, say, like another Deepwood Stalker would be really strong here. So Bloom Sprite could have some influence on how this match goes. Flower Silk Fairy, not a lot of events in Green Yellow Sacrifice, but it still represents a zero-cost collect.
Yeah, like you mentioned, there's just not... It's a very creature-heavy deck because the eventual game plan is getting a creature out that gains stats based on your creatures dying. So in the same way that we're seeing LightSapfier's Blue Jump be very creature-heavy, Green Yellow Sack is very creature-heavy as well. So the Flower Silk Fairy just doesn't get a lot of value unless he can get it to a protected position, potentially off because it has flying on the right side between the wells, and you don't have to worry about building lands over there.
Yeah, it's probably its best use in this situation. Double collector in between the wells, just kind of move it up slowly over time. There's a really good play here with Ninja Toad. I quite like Ninja Toad. I think Light is considering a Tail of the Old Turtle instead. But I feel that Ninja Toad just clears out that Demon Wing. You can move your Tactician down, and then you just have that representation, that 3/5, ready to start picking off creatures in the bottom, or you can just leave it in its position that's currently in. It gets a double collect on the following turn and clear any creature that comes to collect up the left-hand side for MrTea.
Yeah, the only rough thing there of going for that type of a clear is the card generated by the Bloom Sprite could be something like an Elderwood Embrace, and because your Tactician then is surviving if it jumps down into range of these creatures, it can be cleared, and then you lose your only creature. So we do see LightSapfier is not even going to jump down to contest these creatures in this turn. Still is potentially within range of whatever's collecting next turn.
Yeah, he kind of knows that MrTea wants to collect off the bottom left-hand well, and he can then double collect on the follow-up turn. Aurora could maybe play a role in what happens next. But if not, he can just clear the Bloom Sprite and then maybe follow up with another creature he picks up off tail, because he'll have 8 Fairy then, and he could even +1 to 9. So he could get another creature down from the tail of the old turtle. So this just sets up a better turn overall by leaving that Triton in the top left corner.
One of the big things, actually, because LightSapfier is running a very creature-heavy deck, MrTea actually could get a lot of value if he's running something like the Shaitan Assassins, because there isn't Emperor's Command and there isn't Humbling Vision coming out from a blue deck that you would generally expect to see those types of cards. So that potentially could be something that we see MrTea get a lot of value out of throughout the game.
And I think Light just pulled a big play off the top of the deck, the Looking Glass Phantom. Now, this card shuts down the Soul Eater. I'm not sure how many he's running. I think he'd probably be running 3 in this deck. And that's going to play a big role in controlling the big threats, the payoff for Green-Yellow Sacrifice. Then his only real concern is the Bone Collectors. But right now, MrTea hasn't even got a Bone Collector down. So there's no potential for that to snowball yet. So once again, I feel like Light is just in such a good situation.
Yeah, and now because of that Tail of the Old Turtle drawing into a lot of these better setup creatures, had the Triton Trainer come down, and then you get another Tactician that got 2 buffs from its own ability and the extra buff from the Trainer. So a 5/5 really difficult for MrTea to deal with in this situation. He, of course, can get some buffs starting to roll from that Spirit of Rebirth, but the cards in hand aren't really good enough for that Spirit to impact, be a big enough impact onto the board.
So Bloom Sprite's gonna decide a lot here, I think. Run the Bloom Sprite in and see what happens. Alternatively, he could just take a draw, see what he finds. We do see now. Oh, that's not a card you want to see. You definitely needed like a big green body, something like a Verdran Force. I don't know, maybe even an Oak Father would be okay here. But a Seed of Paradise, it does represent a bit of land ramp, but MrTea doesn't have time for that. That's the issue right now.
He's also almost there as well. You don't really need the seed for a single land at this stage. You're already at 4 out of the potential 6 that you need for Soul Eaters. So kind of in a position where MrTea needs to start drawing, but if you draw into Soul Eaters, they're dead cards. So it's just really awkward for this type of a deck right now.
So MrTea's game plan now is just to use the value of the Spirit, just to make sure that the creatures are cheap and they can challenge. The Flower Silk Fairy getting more buffs as a 0 cost is really good. It's just gonna represent more stats and more opportunities to trade here. So Green House Sacrifice doing its thing here. All it really needs is a Bone Collector in that mix somewhere, just to gain more stats.
All of these buffs are going to go onto a Flower Silk Fairy. So if MrTea plays that and is running an event and hits it at the right time, he's going to have a pretty big creature onto the board. But LightSapfier has that Phantasm in hand that we can see, so that's just not going to pan out either. It may potentially be a situation where MrTea uses that Seed of Paradise to actually move up the board, hope that he gets like a 10/10 Soul Eater, and he can just end the game in 2 hits to the orb that way.
Speaking of Bone Collector, does show up in the end. I like going for the water elemental here because you're going to double collect on the left anyway. I can't really see MrTea stopping this. He does push up, going for the Aurora, so going for the heal essentially and gaining extra stats. So just representing so much power and damage next turn.
Well, there is the first Soul Eater, but only a 6/6 at this point is not impactful enough to see either it come down to contest creatures or to go for the race.
It did mean the +1/+1 from the Seed Diet. And we also saw a +1/+1 go back on the Flower Silk. So there's a pretty strong line here of just dropping 11 power on the board. But the Looking Glass Phantom, like you said, it's there. It's waiting. It's waiting for the opportunity to take the clear. And the Water Elemental, the Triton Trainer, are both in positions where they can just take care of the Phantom once it's been transformed.
Demon Wrangler is a decent enough pickup because the Bone Collector can come down and start rolling a little bit, but it's just everything is within range of LightSapfier killing it. It's just MrTea doesn't have the time anymore for the way the green-yellow stack needs to slowly set up.
Do you drop the Soul Eater here, or do you drop the Flower Silk? It's a tough one. I think you kind of have to... I guess you drop both, right? You can just, move across, drop the Soul Eater down, drop the Flower Silk, and just have an army of creatures hoping they can hold off this onslaught from these frogs. The frogs are back in town, guys. They're ready to play.
Yeah, this actually does set up kind of awkward clears from LightSapfier. Just because everything is so compacted, you potentially could get the right clears in the right positions. But what do you actually go for in this situation? Do you use the Looking Glass Phantasm on the 8/8 of the Soul Eater and then try to get backline and clear off the Bone Collector and the Spirit of Rebirth? Do you just punch through efficiently onto some of the smaller creatures that are in front here? It's kind of difficult of the way that LightSapfier is going to take the trades.
I think you have to put the Water Elemental into the 2/2. You then Phantasm the Soul Eater. You clear the Phantasm then with the Triton Trainer. You then jump the 5/3 over and kill the Demon Wing, and then you put the 6/6 into the Bone Collector, or you put the 6/6 into the Spirit. So I think a decision needs to be made here. Like, what do you kill? Do you kill the Bone Collector or do you kill the Spirit? Because they're the problem cards once the Soul Eater has been answered.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Soul Eater has to die this turn, like you mentioned. It's really just which one you value more of. Oh, interesting. It looks like...
Oh, this is nice.
Value.
Oh, wow, okay. I thought the Spirit would come down. I thought the Spirit of Rebirth would die there instead of... Yeah, okay, this is interesting.
I think the big thing there for LightSapfier, if you clear off the Spirit of Rebirth instead of clearing off the 5/5 Flower Silk Fairy, your Phantasm is within range for the Flower Silk to actually take a value trade there.
I see. Yeah,
so I think probably potentially just playing around that rather than caring about the couple extra buffs that Spirit of Rebirth can get.
Hello, a 4/7 Bone Collector. That's pretty good. Not a bad follow-up here. I guess you can put the 5/3 into the 3/5 so the Looking Glasses can kill each other. The Wrangler can kill the 5/1, and then maybe you see what happens with the Bone Collector. You play the Bone Collector first, get those power-ups. Just the positioning. I guess you could put the Bone Collector next to the 6/1, and that will at least get 2 power-ups. But then you could put it next to the Spirit of Rebirth, and that will get 2 power-ups again.
Yeah, it's kind of awkward of where the best spot would be, because the best spot for it would have been a spot that it can't stand on because you need your creature to walk through. Really like going for it on this side because it does contest the creatures there, but it currently just dies to the 2 setup. Although each of those creatures will die, so the Bone Collector would actually gain 1 and it wouldn't die to them.
Well, the Looking Glass Phantom did get picked up here. This is a good opportunity for Light to push again. Just take the Phantom, clear it with the Water Elemental, hit for 6. Maybe put the Phantom in range. But decides to go for the board control option instead. I don't know. What do you think there? Do you go for more
I
aggressive line, or do you
I think you
continue
still
with ball
go for
control?
the Phantasm here, and just clear off everything that MrTea has. Basically, hoping that he doesn't have a Soul Eater in hand, because that would be almost impossible, I think, for LightSapfier to deal with at this point. But yeah, going clear off the Spirit of Rebirth, of course, first, so it doesn't get another proc, and then go for the Phantasm here onto the Bone Collector and just clear it with the Tide Lord. You've already got so much value out of the trades that you've taken. It's just really difficult of what's kind of next, because if MrTea plays something big, LightSapfier doesn't have a lot of options left, and he's starting to slowly lose control back onto the board.
And something I completely forgot about was the Banquet that was sitting inside that Triton there. So the Banquet pops out, going to represent the collection. So that's probably why we saw the Looking Glass go in the middle. So it just has a bit more reach. And now that that Looking Glass has been used, like you were saying, it is going to be difficult to control the Soul Eater. Actually, the Soul Eater might be able to race. Can maybe move to the middle and or move across, clear the Aurora, then represent a 2-hit lethal. It very much depends on what light plays down and if the Soul Eater has to be defensive.
Yeah, a fantastic pickup there for MrTea to get the Soul Eater in what potentially could be the best possible time for it to come out. It represents potentially going for the race, like you mentioned, even though LightSapfier's kind of controlled the early game and dictated a lot of the trades once we saw all of them happen a couple turns ago. MrTea actually hasn't taken any damage because you're so focused on killing creatures before it really gets snowballing. But a fantastic draw right back for LightSapfier, able to find his final Phantasm.
So good. It's just such a good draw. Oh my goodness. The final Phantasm. So the good draw for MrTea there with the Soul Eater, but then LightSapfier comes right back with a good draw of his own, getting that final Phantasm, going to take care of him there and just push the damage. So like you said, damage is something that he didn't have before. Now, the positioning, this is really good because this is a 4/6 and it cannot be cleared alone by the Looking Glass Phantom on the right.
It's super awkward for MrTea now, like you said, because he not only can't clear it just by his own creature, but even if he could, the Banquet still survives. He has no way to deal with that right now. So just super awkward. Unless he had drawn another Soul Eater right there, there was not really a lot of great lines you could come up with for MrTea.
We still have this Beirut sitting in hand for Light as well. He hasn't really had the Furia to play it, but this could be the finisher. This is what LightSapfier needs to just close out the game and represent destroying lands, just slowing down those Soul Eaters for the future. Oh, well, that's a really good draw as well, getting the Fagoro. So again, could just represent more resources, puts a 3/5 in a good position. I think the most difficult thing for Light now is what does he do about layer? Does he just move into collection, clear the layer with a 4/6, and then hit the? I guess you could move across onto the lake with the 3/5 is, so the Banquet is out of position, out of range of the 5/3. He definitely has to deal with this now. I don't think he can leave it alone.
It's really tempting, in my opinion, to clear off the 5/3 and then move the 3/5 to kind of body block, but you don't have anything that efficiently deals with the 3/1 of Leia left behind. So I think you're right that you have to deal with it.
Oh no, he likes your line. He wants to go in. So good to see what Fagoro cooks up here with the Urn. I mean, Urn could actually be really good here because it could pull something he could play like a trainer or maybe like another Banquet. Like, as long as the Urn draws a creature he can play, it just represents a lot of problems. Oh, double Tide Lord. Okay.
Yeah, double Tide Lord, not exactly what you wanted to see there. Can gain a lot of value back on the following turn, but doesn't even have any Tritons down on the board right now. Or sorry, Fagoro is a Triton, so it has just the one that can proc the ability there.
So MrTea once again blocked from collection. Light really valuing the resource starving, which we saw in the blue-red game. Wind Soldier to save the day, does get to collect along the way. Could even play the Spirit as well. It's a 5/5. Get an additional buff, which will go to these Recurrent Shieldmates. It's a very durable creature. So even though Light is still chipping it away at MrTea, he's definitely not out of the match. He still has a lot of gas left over, and we know there is another Soul Eater in deck, and we've seen all the Looking Glass Phantoms, so that Soul Eater could represent a lot of problems.
Yeah, that Soul Eater, if MrTea is able to draw it in time, is going to be uncontested, and a few more creatures have died since, so should hit that 2020 one-hit kill potential. Really like the line there by MrTea of clearing off Fugoro, because it was the only Triton on board, so that type of snowball synergy coming out from the deck is potentially stopped here. But a big thing, like you pointed out a few turns ago, that Beru actually can be very disruptive. There's not an immediate way for MrTea to deal with it. Unless he draws the Soul Eater, I think that could be what ends this game.
Yeah, Central Beirut here on the lake above the desert in the middle. It just destroys 2 lands, which is just very important in this situation. And again, using the creature here to block collection really values starving out MrTea. And we do see a Fanatic in this build. So, like you said, that Soul Eater at its current stat level can one-shot Light. So if he was able to set it up, he could use the mobility trick to go for the lethal. But Beirut, this turn, represents just closing out 2 lands, which is 2 turns of land development for MrTea. And Light could even build a land on the right-hand side of the bottom well and completely landlock MrTea as well. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, I think having the Fanatic in there, you generally want to save that to get the right movement for your Soul Eater. But I think he has to use it in this turn, because like you're saying, if he gets land blocked and Beru is able to get a couple of these lands cleared over the next few turns, he's not going to be able to come back. So he's able to collect this turn with the movement, able to still clear the Banquet, and put his Spirit into a position where it potentially can move up the board and get an aggressive land for the Soul Eater. I think it's a really, really important movement on this turn.
And even goes for +1 here, so quite confident that the Beirut is going to be locked down. Ninja Toad picked up, not enough to clear the structure on its own. If a Triton Trainer was in hand, we'd be in a very hairy spot for MrTea, because Beirut could move up, stop the Spirit, and block the Rakoan, but currently not available. So now, I guess you could just go for a Tide Lord and just represent more power on board. I'm not sure. Maybe you go for a Trainer first and then try to get the value.
I don't mind if the Ninja Toad comes down here and clears the Spirit. You can +1 into another creature on the left side. So I don't mind going for that, just because, of course, you're not setting up quite as big of creatures this turn, but it does represent setting up better for the following turn.
Bloomstride Doomgate does offer some card draw, but no, MrTea just going to scoop, and the Tail of the Old Turtle Blue Jump takes a 3-0 win for LightSapfier. We didn't even get to see the quad color deck. That's the deck I wanted to see, but congrats to Light. He does move on to round 2.
Yeah, it looked like a very strong... I don't even know to call it an adaptation, having the Tail of the Old Turtle in there, but it's a very, very interesting build, the way that he has his deck set up.
Yeah, I hope we see Light in the future. I'd very much want to see what this quad color deck is, and seeing this Blue Jump is very unique with the Tail of the Old Turtle, but that is a card that Light is not a stranger to. So he's been playing the Tail of the Old Turtle decks in the past, using the Angry variant with the Hate Seeds and the Gabbrin Commanders, Axe Grinder, stuff like that. But we are going to go on to a short break now while we find a match for round 2. So don't go anywhere, guys. We'll be back with more Feria action very soon.